Hi, everyone. This is the lecture for Chapter 2, the Internet, Digital Media, and Media Convergence. We're going to be talking about the contemporary landscape. In Chapter 1, we touched briefly on convergence, and today we're going to look at that concept much more closely and how it connects to questions of media ownership and access and their effects on democracy and digital equity. Before we get into the question of our age, the age of convergence of digital media, we'll go back just a little bit to the 20th century to look at the emergence of the digital age and how it led to the age of convergence. The digital age brings digital communication into a widely accessible model. Digital communication works to convert image, text, sound into electronic symbols, which are transported and reassembled as a precise reproduction. Today's internet was started as a military government project in the 1960s, when computers were relatively new technology, and there were only a few very large mainframe computers the size of refrigerators available across the country for researchers to use. In the late 1960s, the Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, came up with a way for researchers to share computer processing time through a network that they called ARPANET, or the net for short. ARPANET had 4 original hosts on the West Coast, so you see in this first image up here on the left. There's just a few little spots. And in only a decade, that grew to reach across the United States and would eventually connect networks internationally, using a wired and distributed network system. ARPANET allowed users from different locations to log into a computer and use it whenever they needed. So that meant you didn't have to be in the same physical location. It allowed communication between distinct research centers that were quite distant. Email, which we still use today, was initially created by ARPANET. ARPANET's original purpose was to be able to communicate quickly and securely, and this is what email was originally designed for. So, unlike the way we tend to think about the web now as a kind of open, easily accessible, far-reaching, international, it was created in the midst of the Cold War and was actually built to carry classified information very securely. So it was the opposite of the way we think of it in our age of search engines. ARPANET was also a public project, meaning that it was government-funded, government-controlled, whereas today's digital landscape is mainly commercialized, especially in the United States. But ARPANET is so important for all of us today because it's an important precursor to the modern internet, and it provided the infrastructure, so the very beginning of the physical frameworks, software and microprocessors that have led us to where we are now. So after the groundwork for the beginnings of what would become the internet was laid by ARPANET, there are close to 30 years before the World Wide Web officially opens in 1991. There's a period of development that's going on where a lot of things are being established. The transition from ARPANET having been a public project into a privately held project, a number of companies getting involved, investors, and all the while, there is still the expansion of the public side of these technologies. You can see here an image of Queen Elizabeth sending her first email in 1976. And already the computer, at least the user interface, has gotten much more manageable. And things happen much more quickly from that point on, of course. So the possibility of the net is really what enabled and propelled the individual and personal computer. In the 1970s, IBM already had a personal computer roughly the size of the one you're looking at here. But because they were still seen as relatively undesirable and not so useful, what would be the purpose of having one of these things in your home unless you were doing certain kinds of computations, right? There was no real reason without an internet to have a personal computer in a lot of ways. So instead, when they were invited to a tech world fair, IBM actually unveiled a new word processor instead of the personal computer they already had. So if you're unfamiliar with word processors, and I don't see why you guys would know what they are, they were a lot, think of a typewriter, but instead of it just immediately putting text on page, you had a little window that allowed you to see like about a line's worth of text and edit it before it transferred that to page. So not unrelated to what we're doing when we have a word processing application in a computer, but very minimal stage. So those were considered still at that point more desirable. In order for us to get to the point where personal computers are desirable and useful, the internet becomes an important process, and it pushes the development of microprocessors inside the computers and also fiber optic cable planning. Once personal computers become more common, the ability to browse the internet and evolves much more quickly with 3 key factors in place. So the first is the development of what's referred to as the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN in the late 1980s, and things go quite quickly from there. Also around the same time, HTML is being developed, so hypertext markup language is a standardization of language across computers so they can communicate easily. Web browsers are also the very beginning of us building a more user-accessible interface. So those 3 steps: the infrastructure of the web, the standardized language, and the user accessible interface all need to come into place for the internet to be something that's desirable to the public and accessible. The internet officially went live in 1991, but I bet if you ask your parents or me, it took a lot longer for us to really start using it regularly. I remember early computer searches on the internet in libraries in 1996 being relatively unfruitful and giving up and going back to books. And you'll see here, I included an image of a film called You've Got Mail from 1998. And this is really the first emergence of a cultural conversation about the effects of something like email technology on the ways that we live. It's a goofy romantic comedy that, should you all have a little extra time at some point, it's a rainy day, it's worth checking out. So for users to really be able to engage in the internet, cable industries had to start providing the infrastructure and resources for people to connect. So people were initially connecting through the phone line, and you would have to switch between the computer and the phone when it was necessary. So you'd be unreachable through one in order to use the other. And then eventually we end up with broadband. But the most important thing is that even with dial-up, there were certain things you could do. You could be on Messenger, and you could definitely have a web address and plug that directly into a browser, but you still had to actually know where you were going. So you would have to type like www.http. Like, I remember we had ads that had the address printed at the bottom of like where you should go to find a web page for something. So the advent of search engines, we could have a general question or just a business we wanted to look for, but not the name and not an address of a specific thing. So for a while, Ask Jeeves was the preferred search engine, and there were many others that competed in the early phases. Bing and Google were two of them. Google, of course, became the most successful and is now the way most people automatically search the internet. And part of what led to its popularity was that it used the algorithm based on a page's popularity to determine its position in a list. So in other words, if you search for a bookshop or something, it's going to find you the one that has been the most repeatedly visited by other people. And in many ways, this was really helpful. It crowdsourced what people had already thought was useful, but it also caused some ripple effects that we'll talk about a little bit later, where the most visible is often become the standard, right? So the next phase of development of digital communication is the expansion of what we refer to as the social aspect. So this is the beginning of social media, in which we move from a read-only culture on the internet to a read-write culture. So with the exceptions of small one-to-one exchanges in, say, Internet Messenger, AOL, for instance, the majority of what we're doing on the internet is really gathering and looking at content that's been put there, websites for businesses, library databases, things like that. And at the birth of the social, we start to move into a position where we're not only searching and gathering data from a few select producers, but we as everyday users are creating content and interacting with people. And social media comprises a lot of different forms of communication, content sharing, collective usage. A lot of these platforms are expanding in the early 2000s, and there's this kind of sense of hope and possibility that new voices are suddenly visible, right? With the ability to produce written content and even find audiences without the need for, say, publishers. If you're a writer, for instance, you can use blogs, or for other content communities like YouTube, as they're emerging, there's the possibility to create the sort of content you would like to have out in the world and not depend on being hired as an actor or picked up by an agent for a book deal or something. In order to be able to put this content out into the world, you can have a direct relationship with your audience. Something like Wikipedia meant that we're no longer relying on publishing houses and the sort of timelines of publishing houses to produce things like encyclopedias, which were often not only out of date, but often gave information from very limited perspectives, the hegemonic vision of the world from those in power. And Wikipedia opened up a huge possibility for people from different parts of the world to weigh in on the way that a particular story or historical event was being represented, changed the way we understood knowledge. So there's a lot of hope and possibility in this time period. And just as the internet and the PC sort of started to change our relationship to how we communicate and what tools we use to do it, mobile devices also emerge and begin to affect our relationship to communication, particularly around the social. So one of the most significant ways that this happened is through the acceleration of convergence. Mobile devices really push us into an age of convergence. So if we remember back So one meaning of convergence involves the technological merging of media content across platforms. So you can also think of it as cross-platform merger. So what that really means is you get a movie that appears in movie theaters, but also on digital streaming sites, and also maybe has a video game that's associated with it. But there are other ways too. So in the early days of PCs, they brought together communication through email and searching capabilities and word processing. But mobile devices have brought together much more. So even more technologies exist in one device. And this in turn has brought convergence to the rest of our hardware at a much more accelerated rate as well. Media convergence on television, for instance. TVs used to be a sort of one-way track of broadcasting with the possibility of plugging in external devices like VCRs eventually or video game consoles. But now a lot of these things are built into them. So the television itself becomes a hub for a number of different ways that media content can come through multiple avenues. And media convergence on our PCs or laptops and desktops means while you're watching this lecture, I'm sure you have a million tabs open. You might have Spotify playing in the background. You probably have a Netflix tab open that you're going to go back to after you can't watch this lecture anymore. And now we're also having work meetings and Zoom classes and all of these things while also probably reading newspapers. Your Canvas site's probably open. So you're in the middle of kind of having a number of different things, if you think about it, from different locations coming at you through this one space, right? And mobile devices propel this convergence even further. So smartphones and tablets are the epitome of device convergence. So they're useful for texting, listening to music, reading books, newspapers, and we see people on trains, seeing movies. These are all things that would never have happened before. So people do schoolwork, Zoom meetings, email, play video games, all on a single device, as well as the other things that it does that we know. It takes photographs, works as a calculator. So two noteworthy trends that mobile devices have taken over the way that we use our internet. Apple, iPhones, iPads, iPods, whatever, they make 5 times more than computers. So these are being made at higher rates, sold at higher rates, and making more money to the companies that produce them. And following COVID lockdowns and our continued relationship to greater digitization of our social lives, we've seen an explosion of things like TikTok. However, so one of the major effects of this, and we see it still with TikTok, but it was particularly pronounced at Facebook, you start to see the production of closed internet or walled gardens. And what that means is that because of the algorithmic structure, that same thing that makes a Google search engine so productive and made it much more desirable than all of the other versions, this fact that the algorithm identifies what people are looking at and redirects you in that way, it also specializes. So you end up in, if you have relatives who are big on Facebook, older folks typically tend to end up in social groups, networks within a social media platform where they're mostly having their own views and their own understanding of the world reflected back at them. And they're very often not having to engage with people who have differences of opinion, differences of life experiences. So they're seeing people who are often close to the same age or the same economic group, same political affiliations. We see this too in TikTok. There have been similar problems as we see facing Facebook, where the proliferation of false information, say about vaccination, has been huge on TikTok. And it's easy to end up in a circle. If you follow one person who does that, then the people who are recommended to you are also probably other people who have similar views. And before that, you've built a network where you're isolated within people of like-minded considerations. There are different TikToks and different communities on TikTok, and you find your way into them through the algorithm. So these have significant effects on how we understand things. And it's only going to expand because we're also now seeing our physical world affected and altered through our relationship to media. We're at the beginning of experimental media, so virtual reality, augmented reality, that use natural user interfaces, meaning you might not necessarily have to actually look at it or touch a screen anymore. A lot of technology is being built around monitoring our eye movements when we're looking at screens so that we can select things without actually having to make the choice to go from, I think I'd like to look at that, I'm going to touch it. That sort of moment of consideration that decision gets made for us based on our eye movements. These are things that are starting to build further. And with that as well, what's referred to as the semantic web. So the semantic web places basic information of the web into meaningful categories. And what that really means is something like Siri or Alexa can answer simple questions for you, but can also start to do things like turn lights on and off. And so we have the beginning of, and the expansion now really, of what's referred to as the Internet of Things, meaning the way that the internet has entered into our physical existence and the things, the actual material aspects of our lives. So Amazon Ring will connect a personal assistant to the internet, and be able to lock or unlock your doors or turn on your heat or start your oven while you're away at command, because of its ability to organize information into these meaningful categories and respond to them in relatively simplistic ways, but that have very big impactful effects on our lives. So we're heading into an ever-increasing presence of media in our lives, as we said. In media studies, we do three things. We investigate how media is created, like by whom and for what intention. So ARPANET, right, creates the beginnings of the internet with this one purpose, with this intention. And then we also think about what media says, so looking at content. And then finally, one of the last things we really try to focus on is what effects do they have on audiences and how audiences respond to and interact with them. So we have to ask, what is the effect of all of this convergence, like the fact that suddenly all of these aspects of our lives exist in one place, and it represents as we experience it as ease, but what are some of the other effects? So media consumption is mobile and flexible, and this means we consume media everywhere now. So what might have been an hour of TV at the end of the day, or I remember in the 80s, they were very concerned when I was a small child that people were watching over 2 hours of television in a day, and they were worried about what that was going to do to people. And so maybe you might have watched 2 hours of TV and read the newspaper on the commute in the morning or something, has now turned into an average of 7 hours of media consumption per day for most Americans. So that's everything from waking up in the morning and turning on music that you listen to or a podcast that you like for your commute in the morning, to reading the newspaper on your phone, like reading a news site on your phone, to checking out TikTok at 2:30 in the morning when you should be sleeping. All of those adds up to basically the equivalent of an entire work day of us looking at media. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because we are working when we're looking at media, just not for ourselves necessarily. So merging of media into one device also blurs the distinction between what used to be different forms of media. So formats are starting to morph, and we're starting to see things overlap. And that affects the way business engages with us and the way we engage with our own social spaces. Media are experienced in multiple manners simultaneously. So again, you might be listening to Spotify and reading the news at the same time, or doing an exercise video on YouTube, or while also listening to a podcast. The other thing that happens in this moment is that lines between being a consumer and a producer are also less clear. So one of the reasons I wanted to ask you guys to make the mass media mini lectures is to think a little bit about what it means to make content and what it means to try to convey meaning quickly, because I think a lot of us are in the process of making media all the time without necessarily realizing how much content production we're doing, as well as actually just the work of looking, of being an audience. So this also connects to some radical changes in how the businesses that own platforms and profit off of our attention to media have imagined structuring themselves. And it has really impactful effects on our experiences of our social existences. So we're going to talk about a couple of those things in this little next segment. So a big part of what keeps our eyes on media has been constructed as the fear of missing out, which can apply to both, and I think was imagined initially as applying to IRL situations being represented. So you're looking at Instagram and you see a party you weren't invited to, and you have a feeling of, why wasn't I there? So this notion that other people are living more exciting lives than you are, but what's sort of this idea that we're missing something that we're seeing documented outside. But also something I think has also started to shift in this, possibly in part because of COVID, but I think just because of the expansion of social media into our everyday existences, is we might also feel this kind of FOMO feeling about things that are happening inside of social media, which is exactly what companies want. So people might feel like they missed something if they don't catch a trend quickly enough. So if you're a TikTok producer, and so many people are at this point, if you're not catching a particular moment, like at the moment, or you're like not on a specific trend, the life of a sound for a TikTok post is getting incredibly short. So how quickly it goes from appearing to blowing up to then being like, okay, like that's over. And people who are still using it are a little bit like past the moment, is how we're starting to understand these things. And there's a kind of anxiety for people who do this sort of work to keep current. And whether you're a producer or not, studies have indicated that the more time we spend on social media, it can potentially lead to decreased happiness. And that has a lot to do with this sort of compare and despair part of what functions under FOMO, where we're looking at the world and thinking about all of the things we're not doing or we don't have, or way of experiencing our lives as if we're looking at it from the outside, right? And but I do want to counter that just a little, because I think that notion fits in with a very specific way that we currently use social media, like the mass version of what it means to exist on social media. But there are also studies that show that we do build meaningful relationships on social media, and that often people find communities that they could not have found or been part of without social media, without the internet. And I think maybe some of us feel this kind of tension. We build connections, as well as having this kind of tension of the possibility of it making us feel somehow less than, and really presenting some pretty serious dangers to our sense of self and our mental health. So it's not a simple question of good or bad. We gain a lot and we also risk a lot from social media and its continued expansion. And so there are some ways we can think about how to maximize the good of these possibilities and connections while also negotiating some of the sort of more negative effects, how to reduce them. So this paradox, not only can social media have complicated and seemingly conflicted effects on our individual and social lives, but it also has a really conflicted or paradoxical effect on our political and civic lives. So the expansion of social media has been both understood as a great potential for the voices of the people to resist controlling powers of oligarchies and repressive regimes, to fight racism and connect people not necessarily represented in traditional media. It's been vital for people connecting through Black Lives Matter during COVID, at times when these were really important moments for people to be able to find each other. And arguably, a lot of these things would not have happened were there not for the capacity of people to quickly organize through something like social media. But also, at the same time, as the platform can do this, it can also expand the power of those regimes through isolating people into those walled gardens that we're talking about, and also facilitating control of ideas really easily through that, through false information, through the limitation of access to those who might disagree. In the reading I assigned for you this week, Elves versus Trolls, this sort of situation where you got to see how people negotiate what it means to have an open internet and social media, and how a small group of people are trying to resist one version of false information presented through the platform of social media, of Facebook. In the interview in 2018 about Facebook's responsibility for the spread of disinformation about the 2016 elections, founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg not only suggested that as a platform, the company should not be held responsible, but that they were overwhelmed, right, by the scope and reach of Facebook. So there was just too much for them to be able to manage, was the way that they discussed their relationship to how much responsibility they felt they should have for what was being said and shared on Facebook. So I'm going to have you guys watch a documentary called The Facebook Dilemma if you haven't already come across it. But what's interesting in this notion of we're just overwhelmed is that even in the process of saying something like that it was a small company, you had no idea it was going to get this big, didn't know it was going to have this kind of an impact, there's still at the same time a continued expansion of ownership by Facebook of more and more platforms. So as you may or may not know, Instagram used to be an independently owned platform, and it was purchased by Facebook. So this is what we're referring to when we're starting to talk about the consolidation of ownership and how this creates larger problems. So up until now, we've been looking at one definition of convergence, the technological merging of media across platforms and the accumulation of technological capabilities on devices. But there's a second definition of convergence described as a business model that consolidates various media holdings under one corporate umbrella. And this is why many people struggle in this class with the difference between consolidation and convergence. I think it's very confusing sometimes, because the truth is they are legitimately linked. So the process that leads to convergence also is involved with business consolidation. So that the same company owns the movie theater franchise where you see a movie, also owns a streaming channel where you can watch it later, and owns the app development company. And so all of the forms of content across platforms profit only one large company. And it also means that Instagram gets bought by Facebook, and so does WhatsApp, and YouTube gets bought by Google, which in turn is owned by Alphabet. And so there are less and less owners. There's at the top of this process. So what ends up seeming like a plethora of sites and apps actually represents not only the profits, but the interests, both economic and political, of a very small group of companies and a very small number of individuals that control those companies. And this creates simultaneously a really limited sphere of control, while at the same time, we have this incredible access to a hub of creation, distribution, and communication, because as they're buying these things, they're also fine-tuning them. Instagram got to be a much more user-friendly app and was much more popular after Facebook bought it than it had been up until that moment, and it became much more visible. So these are the tensions of what it means to have these major conglomerates. So I wanted you guys to see this slide here, and this is something I can link to if anyone's really interested. But this orb right here in the corner, the one that goes around my head, that's Alphabet. And Alphabet is who owns Google. And you can see all of these other things that are owned inside of that. So of course there's Android and there's YouTube and a number of other things. And you can see up at the top there, Facebook has Instagram and Messenger and WhatsApp. And there are other things even that we're not necessarily that are not so visible at this point. And during COVID, all of this further expanded. We had a huge amount of consolidation occur in the midst of COVID buyouts. So certain companies got purchased, and a lot of this has shifted really drastically. So if we're looking at these companies that control all of the sites and spaces that we look at on the internet and who own them, we're faced with this question of who owns the internet, right? Like the whole of the internet. And it's a complicated answer. The answer is no one and everyone, because the internet is a network of networks. And each of the separate networks belongs to different companies and organizations, and they rely on physical servers in different countries with varying laws and regulations. So maybe a better question for us to ask is who controls the internet? And all of the platforms and technologies that we've just been looking at are controlled by companies, and they work to wield a great deal of money and influence to change laws in their favor. So even if you might have a country where the majority of the servers and the cables are controlled by the government itself, corporate interest is going to come in and try to affect law in their favor, so that, say, Google has more access, that they're feeling that they're not impeded in their business practices in that location using those servers. So in the Telecommunications Act of 1996, our first major overhaul of communications law in almost 62 years. So from 1996 back to 1934, a lot of technology has changed in that time. But you did have the beginnings of broadcast, right? Radio had become very popular at that point. But this law, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, was the first major overhaul that included any regulations of the internet. The internet hadn't existed for any previous moment. So that means that for the first 30 years, the internet was developing. It was largely unregulated. According to people who wrote the law, the goal of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 is to let anyone enter any communication business and to let any communications business compete in a market against any other. So a lot of what this means is it's represented as supposedly the deregulation that allows for free market competition. However, the critiques have suggested that it's had a very different effect. So what was supposed to be a free market approach has actually worked to facilitate the expansion of these already huge corporations that in fact hinder the development of newer, smaller, and possibly different platforms and companies that might do something different in the way that they function on the internet. So it's actually facilitated the consolidations that we're talking about. So potentially the biggest threat to the internet's democratic potential is commercialism. The internet's potential for widespread use is preempted often by these narrower commercial interests. And what that means is companies don't particularly care about the effects of the use of their products. They just want you to continue to look at the content on their platforms, because the more people that are looking, the more money the platforms get from advertisers whose ads appear on their site or to whom they are selling your data. Advertising is getting more and more sophisticated as we move on in the way that it uses media platforms that we look at. So all of the social media that you look at on a regular basis is gathering data about you. We are all constantly being mined for information. And they look at a lot of different things. They look at how long you look at a website, or how long you stay on a post, or what kinds of things you like, or what feelings maybe you're expressing. There's a lot of mood monitoring that's currently happening in social media usage. And that then all of this data is then either sold directly to an advertising company, or it is bought by an intermediary company that buys the data and sells it to other advertisers and marketing companies. In the past, when marketing companies wanted to figure out how better to sell us things, they had to do research. They had to bring people in, let them know they were doing it, have all of these conversations, ask them lots of questions. But from the perspective of marketers, they don't get the kind of data they're looking for in that moment. We're too aware of what we're doing in that moment when we're told. And so they get better data from their perspective by having us accept the terms and conditions button on an app, and then having all of this access to the kinds of choices we make when we think we're not being watched, when we think we're in private moments. So this further complicates our question of who controls the internet. If we know that technically no one and everyone owns the internet, but it's largely controlled by a sort of complex interaction between a few controlling companies and relatively minimal government regulation, we now factor in the interests of advertisers who want to access the data that media platforms make very easy to attain quickly and relatively cheaply. How are the critical questions of the internet decided? So if we go back to the effects of consolidation on social media and democracy, what are our most critical questions? The book lays these out for us as the three issues that really connect for us are the security of personal and private information. So all those things that we're just talking about, but also other things, the fact that we buy things online. And so our credit cards, our personal data of our social security numbers, all sorts of things move through all of these networks at various points. So security, and then who decides the appropriateness of online material? So if we're going back to some of our questions about disinformation and say Russian trolls, there's a lot of questions about who gets to decide what can even be there. And this brings up huge questions that are different from country to country about free speech and access. And then finally, the last question is the accessibility and openness of the internet is one of the key factors of democracy. So if we think of social media in particular as potential sites of communication, the ability to access the internet and to share questions and to do these kinds of things is largely determines your ability to participate in contemporary life in a lot of ways, as I hope you all heard with Vicky Katz's guest lecture this week. So security, as we've already said, whenever you use the internet, you are giving away personal information. And not only to the media platform miners that you agree to when you do accept terms and conditions, but also the government in America, the government has the right to survey our online activity based on the Patriot Act of 2001. And as of 2012, 7% of Americans were victims of identity theft. So basically, what we tend to think of as private spaces are actually constantly being monitored by a number of people, whether that's nefarious interests of people trying to gather data on us for the purposes of identity theft, or it's just the standards of our government monitoring, all of the nice jokes about our NSA guy, whoever might be watching you whenever you're watching Netflix or whatever. And then on top of that, the advertisers that we all supposedly agree to. So a second question is who gets to decide what can be online and who can access it? So as of now, there are very few laws that are specific to the internet about what can be there. And most of what is banned, like most of what is illegal, was already illegal in other places. In any forms of communication, if you are committing a crime, so fraud, if you're using email to try to convince somebody you're someone you're not in order to get money or something, or if you're documenting a crime and presenting images of that, so for instance, animal cruelty, or if you're actively inciting a crime, all of those things are already illegal in other media formats as well. And so that has applied to the internet. However, much of this is incredibly difficult to keep off of the internet, in part because of all of these separate networks, right? So with there not being one person or one entity that owns the internet or one entity that even controls it, but that it happens through multiple places, there are considerably more regulations in the United States about who and where what already is online can be accessed. So for example, our book talks about the Children's Internet Protection Act of 2003, which required public schools and libraries to use filtering software to limit minors' exposure to inappropriate internet content. And I'm sure you as a generation grew up with the sort of ineffectiveness and also clunkiness of a lot of the ways that those things get enacted. There's a lot of different reactions to this and different opinions. So many people want the web to be completely unregulated. They believe that for there to be genuine free speech, you should be able to say, do, and present anything you want on the internet, and people have to be responsible for the ways that they look at it and allow their children to look at it. Others believe that the government needs to further step in and do more to actually regulate what is allowable on the internet and what can be found, and pursue criminal charges of people who do things like incite violence much more aggressively than they currently do. And then still others, as we saw with the case of Facebook and the Zuckerberg trials, believe that the companies that own and operate the platforms bear the bulk of the responsibility for filtering what appear on their sites. And this is a fascinating question because then that ends up asking a lot of questions of who is actually responsible for going through material and making those kinds of decisions of whether or not something violates either a law or a community regulation. And there are numerous debates about this. So another incredibly important aspect of media democracy is equitable access. Digital inequity, often referred to as the digital divide, happens on a number of levels. 3 in particular. The first is access to hardware. So that's laptops, phones, etc. The second is access to a means of connecting that to the internet. And third is a fair and equitable use of that connection. For that first issue of hardware itself, many people have argued that smartphones and tablets address a lot of the hardware issues of the digital divide, especially as there are increasingly more inexpensive options available. However, they are not necessarily helpful to some of the important uses of digital tools. So, like education, for instance. As many of you who may have already tried to navigate Canvas on a smartphone or a tablet have experienced, they don't necessarily work the best for certain things. The second factor, access to a means of connection. Some of the most important things we need to do in order to fight the digital divide is really work to close this gap in who has access. And in America, this is becoming increasingly pronounced and has been pointed out during COVID, as fewer companies have control over broadband and cellular Wi-Fi access. What we're seeing is they're setting often unattainable costs for poorer Americans. So while America is better than many countries, we are still pretty far from the top, as you saw from the article I sent to you all on Estonia, which demonstrates how by choosing to see communication through broadband as a human and providing it free for all, Estonia has effectively closed their digital divide. And you have this lovely photograph here behind me of an older gentleman sitting with his sheep looking at a tablet out in the fields because broadband is everywhere in Estonia, and this is from their tourism page. And of course, the last of these has to do with the equitable access to those means of connections, even once you've paid for them. As we saw this at Neutrality, major telephone companies want to profit by offering faster connections and priority in line to those who are willing to pay higher rates. And this has all been played out in long legal battles that began in 2014, as you saw in our videos. Another way to think about the democracy of media is the importance of the breadth of what we can find and what tools we have to use to make content. 2 ways to think about this are the software we use to make things and how things actually appear on the internet and for how long. So on the first hand, software being privatized as it has been, where we have to buy it from a few companies in order to be able to communicate with one another. So I need to buy Microsoft Word in order to be able to present a document and share it with someone else. Software being privatized limits who has access to what based on financial resources. And so people who create open source software where the codes are free and you don't have to pay for them resist not only the financial barriers, but sometimes the limiting effects of monopolized software can have on how we produce things and what we can produce with it. People who use Linksys or something like that, for instance, will have had different experiences of feeling like they have more control over setting up their interface. There are a lot of open software uses for video editing and other things where people say that there's more flexibility than what's available in some of the more supposedly user-friendly but expensive pre-existing software that we buy. And then second, there's also this aspect of digital archiving. So what appears on the internet and for how long? We all imagine that everything that goes on the internet is just there forever. But there's a really great article by someone named Jonathan Zittrain called "The Internet is Rotting." So because everything is so cost-based, as various blogs, news sites, and other sources of information are often shut down because they haven't been monetized through advertisers, and they can't necessarily, as individuals funding them, continue to support paying for them to be on the internet, and often with no one else to keep them up, a lot of that data is being lost. And this happens, of course, really unevenly. So the historical record of our time that will emerge from the internet will be the story of those who could afford to pay to keep sites up and who were appealing enough to advertisers to be monetized. So, for instance, I wrote for an art journal for years that because we did really international work and we looked at a lot of political and social effects of art in places that not everyone was necessarily interested in from a marketing perspective, that website, when the founder of that art journal was no longer able to keep it up, ended up being shut down. So digital archivists aim to provide citizens with universal access to more than 85 million archived web pages. So we have a record of what the internet really is and was. Digital archiving is really trying to make sure that what we think of as valuable isn't completely determined by what was valuable to advertisers. So through the rest of the semester, we're going to be talking about how social media distribution allows for greater democratizing potential than any traditional media, but that also allows governments and companies unprecedented access to our lives, and the consolidation of ownership threatens that democratic potential by narrowing what we see to commercial interests. And so this has both positive and detrimental effects on our lives and relationships, depending in part on who controls the messages we receive through it. And we're going to look at how that kind of conversation has existed around almost every media innovation throughout history. It's not unique to our own age. It's maybe a little more accelerated. And then finally, we're going to talk about the concerns about how the internet should be accessed and regulated by whom and for whom. And those things will continue to come up for us. And similarly, we'll see they came up for other forms of media as well. Okay, that is it for our lecture for this week. I really appreciate you sticking with me.